Arguments between siblings can be some of the meanest that you might ever encounter. When brothers and sisters get going, it can quickly become nasty. I'm not talking about that sort of constant low-level bickering that might take place in the back seat of a car on a long journey, though I'm sure that many parents will testify that such arguments can be very, very draining. But I'm talking about when something really flares up. Doesn't even have to be over any matter of great significance. In fact, often an argument may start about something entirely insignificant, but it doesn't take long before the voices start to get louder and the faces start to get redder, and soon the cry of "You're not my dad, you're not my mum" goes up. "It's none of your business." Tempers start to flare and the shouting is well and truly underway. And what's being shouted has really got nothing to do with what started the argument. And occasionally they reach a crescendo, and one storms out, slamming the door behind them, with the one still in the room claiming victory. But occasionally, too, they end because one of the siblings goes too far and says something incredibly hurtful. I'm sure parents have experienced that. I'm sure we've all perhaps experienced it ourselves. And growing up, I had many such arguments with my sister. Sometimes it was me, sometimes it was her that used that nuclear option and went too far and said the hurtful thing. But whether it was me or whether it was her, our defence was always the same. But it was true. And that's why arguments, I think, between siblings can be some of the meanest. Because brothers and sisters know each other's weaknesses. And when their arguments degenerate, they don't end with nasty name-calling and insults, even though they may pass through those stages en route. When they degenerate, they end up with truth-telling. Home truths that really do hit home and can pierce like a knife. Truths that have perhaps been shared at calmer times in the context of what is usually a safe and loving relationship now get brought up in the heat of an argument. Truths that were shared for support in moments of felt weakness are now weaponized. And when truth is used in that way, the pain is keen and the wounds run deep. It's through having argued with my sister in such ways that I had to learn the importance of apologising when I'm wrong. And also the importance of accepting the apologies of others when they're offered too. I had to learn that, but it was true, was never a good enough justification to say some of the things that I would have occasionally said to my sister when I was angry. I had to learn that, but it was true, never meant that an apology would be unnecessary. I had to learn that just because something is true is not good enough reason for it to be said at that moment. Just because something is true is not good enough reason for it to be said at that place, and certainly just because something is true is not good enough reason for it to be said in that manner. The matter of truth is of utmost importance for the follower of Jesus. We're sinful people. We live in a fallen world, and that's why Jesus came. It's why he had to come. It's uncomfortable to be reminded of the fact that we are sinners, but it is truth. But sometimes the church becomes a little bit obsessed with truth, blinkered to all else. And sometimes we declare truth, forgetting what we should have learnt as children, that just because something is true is not good enough reason for it to be said then and there and in that way. Let me give you an example. I've got a good friend who lived, sadly, in an abusive relationship. She suffered for years, married to a man who thought it was perfectly acceptable to physically assault his wife, and who systematically demeaned her and emotionally dominated her. She'd managed to keep it quiet for years, but finally enough was enough, and she knew that she needed to leave for her own sake and for the sake of her child. She was physically broken, and she couldn't bear his mental torment anymore. And she was increasingly concerned that her daughter would think that such behaviour was normal when she became old enough to have a relationship herself and marry. And so, after years of suffering, she left her husband and instructed her solicitors to sue for a divorce. And when she did, she says that her church turned on her. She sought advice from her minister, who simply said, God hates divorce, but didn't remind her that God also loved her. He then systematically pointed out to her some passages of Scripture to support his statement. She left that church soon, never to return. And when she left feeling utterly condemned and rejected. Now, I confess that I can see where her minister was coming from, for I believe that God would want us to live in a world where divorce did not happen, where it did not even exist. But I believe that that's because he wants us to live in a world where divorce is unnecessary. I believe that God hates divorce because he hates the reasons for divorce, not because he hates the act itself, and certainly not because he hates people who've been through one. I believe my friend's minister spoke the truth when he said God hates divorce, but just because it was true was not good enough reason for it to be said at that moment. Just because it was true was not good enough reason for it to be said of that situation. Just because it was true was not good enough reason for it to be said in the manner that he did. And of course, the mistakes that are made in speaking truth are not confined solely to the discussion of divorce. Part of the church's mission is to speak out against all forms of social injustice and to speak out against sin. We exist to declare the best way of living, to demonstrate the life that God intended for us all to have. And yet too often when the church has tried to do just that, we come across as angry, condescending and judgmental, an out-of-touch body of arrogant Puritans, a collection of goody two-shoes trying to impose an outdated and irrelevant moral code onto others. When the church has spoken out against the problems we face in our society and how we ought to live, too often we've left people hurting in our wake. The truth that we seek to speak has been eclipsed by our bad timing, our inadequate situational awareness, our poor tone, and our failure to express ourselves fully. And in consequence, the beautiful truth ends up looking ugly. We see this misplaced truth-telling in today's reading from Job. We're well aware of the suffering that Job has and is enduring, and his friend has come to sit with him. But when his friend finally speaks, his words sound harsh. He utters home truths rather than solace, criticism rather than succour, theology rather than consolation. Eliphaz chooses to confront Job rather than to comfort him. Is that what you would want from a friend? Is that how you think God would have wanted Eliphaz to speak? When Eliphaz speaks, what he says is true, but that doesn't mean that what he said was right. He speaks unkindly, judgmentally, and lacking compassion, which is why many chapters later, when God finally speaks into this situation, his response to Eliphaz is, I am angry with you because you have not spoken accurately about me. That might seem hard to understand, for what Eliphaz has said is true. Painful as it is to admit, for we don't like the timing of his words nor the manner in which he says them, his theological analysis still has got merit. God does punish wickedness and transgression, and sometimes that comes immediately. Think of stories like Uzzah being struck down for stabling the Ark of the Covenant, or in New Testament times, think of the story of Ananias and Sapphira, who both die. If we were to take any one part of what Eliphaz says, we'd struggle to find something wrong, and yet when we view it in its totality, we see that it's misplaced. He says there's no such thing as truly good people. that none of us deserve the good things that happen to us. Can we deny that? If we're to look at life's tragedies as cause and effect, then all of us have done more than enough bad things in our lives to bring bad things into our lives too. There's undeniable truth in the words of Eliphaz if we take his statements one by one. Indeed, he's even quoted by the Apostle Paul in his first letter to the Corinthian church. But the overall impression given by Eliphaz is wrong, for he makes the Lord appear like a monster, as one who waits for a man to fall so that he can then crush him with his justice and wrath. In Eliphaz's speech to Job, truth is built upon truth, and yet the theology that it produces is not correct. For Eliphaz has managed to create a heartless theology. No wonder, therefore, that God says to him, I'm angry with you, for you've not spoken rightly about me. Truth matters. But as Paul wrote, followers of Jesus must always speak truth in love. The Christian's demeanour is just as important as his or her words. Graciousness needs to be at the very heart of the Christian life. I've said it before, but just because something is true is not good enough reason for it to be said. Or at least not good enough reason for it to be said whenever, wherever, and however we like. God cares about more than just the words you say. He also cares about how you say those words. It's not enough to always speak the truth. You must also speak the truth in love. Truth can be a powerful instrument, a tool that can be wielded like a surgeon's knife. It can be guided well to bless and to bring healing, but it can also be crudely applied to wound, to cripple, to damage and to destroy. Tim Keller put it this way: truth without love is imperious self-righteousness. Truth without love is self-centered and arrogant. It hurts, manipulates, and cuts others down in order to elevate the speaker. As important as truth is, often we need truth and more. Truth alone is insufficient. Truth is but one element of the armour of God for the equipping of the church. If it's going to be put to God's service, it must also be paired with other virtues like righteousness and peace. When it comes to how you speak, God will hold you to a greater standard than simply truth. Notwithstanding the 9th commandment that you shouldn't bear false witness, the standard he will hold you to is not whether what you say is true, but by whether it was loving and gentle and kind. Did it show evidence of the fruit of the Spirit? In forming the church, God chose to create a unique, set-apart people whose lives are based on truth, but with a culture that's marked by the same genuine kind of love found in Jesus. Motivated by the truth of the gospel, that Jesus the Good Shepherd laid down his life for his sheep, for us, that empowers us to love one another by laying down our lives in the way that we love and serve too. At times, the church simply becomes infatuated with truth. The important questions at times seem to be, do you believe X? Do you believe Y? What does God say about A or B or C? They're important questions, and throughout history, the church has wrestled long and hard with truths and paradoxes to form its established belief. Yet our reading from Corinthians earlier tells us that truth will come to an end. Words will be stilled and knowledge will pass away. At the culmination of history, only 3 things will remain: faith, hope, and love. And the greatest is love. When instructing his disciples, Jesus didn't tell them that he wanted the mark of their community to be the orthodoxy of their theology. He didn't say they will know that you are Christians by the correctness of your preaching. He didn't even say they'll know you're Christians by the purity of your membership. They would be known by their love. their love for each other, and their love for the world. Navigating the moral dilemmas of today's world is not easy. What should we believe? What does God say about this or that? They're important questions on which we need to form answers. How should we interact with those of other faiths, particularly here in Blackburn? How should we interact with the Muslim community? How can we be people of faith in an increasingly secular world? What about war or intensive animal farming? What about genetic modification or embryonic stem cell treatment or poverty? What does the Bible say about homosexuality? What does the Bible say about gender fluidity? What about abortion or euthanasia? Truth is important, but we must also recognise that those questions do not simply stand alone as philosophical curiosities. Those questions come attached to real people with real heartbeats. Too often the church has answered these questions like Eliphaz. Truth built upon truth, built upon truth, building a rigid theology. And too often it's been a heartless theology. I wonder how God will respond to his church for those times. Will he answer us as he did Eliphaz? Listen one last time as I finish to the words of Paul. If I had the gift of all prophecy and all truth, and if I understood all of God's secret plans and possessed all knowledge, and if I had such faith that I could even move mountains, but didn't love others, I would be nothing. 3 things only will last forever: faith, hope, and love. And the greatest of these is love.